2016. May we have the roll call?
Council members: Friedman, Garpetian,
Here.
Sinanian,
Here.
Mayor Devine, Mayor Pro Tem Najarian.
Here. And the roll call says it all. Acting as the Mayor Pro Tem in the absence of Mayor Devine, I will be running this meeting. May we have your report, please?
Thank you. The agenda for the October 18, 2016 special public meeting of the City Council was posted on Thursday, October 13, 2016 on the bulletin board outside City Hall. Next item before you is the minutes of the Joint Housing and City Council meeting of September 20th, 2016.
Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Second.
And if there are no objections or corrections proposed, the minutes will be approved unanimously by those present. Next item.
Next is a public hearing, Director of Community Development, regarding amendments to Title 30 of the Glendale Municipal Code 1995 relating to accessory wall signs in the downtown specific plan, Gateway and Broadway Center districts. Two ways an ordinance for introduction.
And let me go forward and say that by way of email, council and city staff were notified that there was a possible misnoticing of this item, and in conference, as a result of a conference with the city manager and city attorney, we find that there would be no prejudice or permanent harm to anyone in light of the fact this is the action today would be the introduction of the ordinance. A full all rights will be reserved for anyone who would like to comment on this at the next City Council meeting. Mr. City Attorney.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just to add to that, in addition, that this item obviously was noticed in accordance with the Brown Act, so it complies with that particular statute. In addition, the email that you referenced the issue of whether or not this item had been properly initiated by the City Council, and there was some confusion regarding that item. There were two items when the item was initiated. This item and another item that's coming back later. The items were presented to the council on the same night, but made separately, and then at the end of both presentations, the item was moved, and under our procedures, that means that both items were moved and seconded and voted upon. So this matter is properly before you.
Thank you. Mr. Ochoa.
Yes, sir. With no further ado, we'll have our principal planner, Kristen Asp, review the item that was initiated by this council earlier this year.
Thank you. Back in April of 2016, the City Council initiated considering expanding the rules to accessory wall signs in the downtown specific plan, Gateway and Broadway Center districts to consider allowing tenants of all buildings, including those on upper stories, to have accessory wall signs. Because currently our rules allow for signs for each ground floor and second floor occupancy that directly faces a street, alley, mall, or parking area. It is measured at a 1-to-1 ratio, the length of the occupancy to the sign area. So what this generally means is that third level occupancies and above are generally not entitled to wall signs. However, there are other options for buildings that are taller than that to consider, which is a high-rise wall sign, like, for instance, Nestle, and accessory ground signs. So the proposed revisions would allow any occupancy in a building the ability to seek permission for accessory wall signs. They would still be limited to the location on the first and second floor, and we would consider this through a sign program process. The two districts, the Gateway and Broadway Center district, are outlined in the blue, so around Brand at the freeway and at Broadway, close to the Galleria. Sign programs, we have criteria that evaluate sign programs. They should be compatible with project architecture, not unduly compete with or obstruct other businesses, be of a harmonious design, and be consistent with any other applicable plans. And the sign program alternative addresses concerns related to the location and number of signs, which a sign program would identify, to prevent any concerns for sign clutter. But it is likely that all tenants may not be able to have a wall sign because of limited space and compatibility with the architecture. And it is possible that a typical ground floor use may not be able to have a sign if the area is already occupied by an upper tenant. These are just some examples of the buildings in these districts that would be eligible. So again,
I'm sorry, when you say they wouldn't have a sign, you mean they wouldn't be able to have a sign above their window, but they could still put a sign in their own window?
in their own window signs are treated differently, but for an actual wall sign, if that space has been used up through the sign program, it's possible that a new ground floor tenant may not be able to have that space.
So you could have a situation where, because of not being able to have the sign that's right above their store or restaurant, they'll be more inclined to put a sign in their window, thereby increasing the number of signs you'll have at the front of the building?
Not necessarily. You could have an accessory wall sign and a window sign today. There's no limit
You'd have less
to one or the
incentive to
other.
do that. If you're a business that can't get that space above your store, then
That
you
is a
definitely are
potential.
going to want to put your sign in their window. But if you already have it up there, you may not want to put another sign in your window.
Quite possibly. And just another example of a building. This was heard by the Planning Commission in September, and they recommended approval of the proposed amendments as drafted. I'm available for any questions.
Can you go back to one of your building slides so we can, okay, let's,
Okay.
either one is fine.
Sure.
So there's a bank on the ground floor, I presume, and that sign that we see on the top of the first floor, let's say that's the bank's name, the first floor tenant, and that's limited, the size of that sign is limited by what?
The size of that sign is limited by their occupancy frontage. So whatever their linear frontage is on Brand, which is the right side of the picture, whatever that length of frontage is determines their maximum area.
Could their neighbor next door on the same building, I think there's an Ameria Bank in that building, could they also put a wall sign?
Under today's code or under the proposed?
Current.
Under today's code, if they're on the ground floor and they have a frontage on Brand, correct. Yes.
So what are we permitting, let's say there's a fourth floor tenant, State Farm Insurance, let's say. They cannot place a sign on the first floor.
Correct.
Can they place a sign on the second floor?
Under today's code, first and second floor occupancies are who are eligible to have
only
signs.
those.
Correct. They could consider a high-rise wall sign in this situation for buildings that are 6 feet or 6 stories and above.
And that's where, at the very top of the
At
building?
the very top of the building.
Like you said, Nestle.
Nestle is an example that most people are familiar with.
Okay. So the ordinance today, the modifications that we're making, does what? What does
It
that-
would make the fourth floor occupant eligible to consider a sign on the first or second floor through a sign program process.
Okay.
So we'll review it to identify the locations and materials of signs, and it's open to,
And that's
all
entirely up
tenants of a building.
to the building owner?
it's up to the building owner, correct?
And are they still limited to the linear
The
frontage?
area that will be considered will be a 1-to-1 for the building frontage. So if, for instance, this is a 100-foot building on the first floor, we would divvy up that 100 square feet.
So, I'm sorry if you don't mind. So, all right, so can you clarify for me then, forgetting about what tenant's going to be on the signs, let's put all that aside. Is there a change to the amount of signage that's allowed? Will this ordinance allow for more signage on these buildings?
Potentially, if there are only 2 occupancies on the ground floor today, there's 2 signs that are on the first level. In the situation where you're opening up the entire building to all the tenants to be eligible there, we would, through a sign program process, figure out the locations of signs appropriate to this architecture and it could potentially be 4 or 5, depending
Is there
on.
a limit within the ordinance?
There's not a limit.
If your
Just an
staff
area
decides-
limit.
If your staff decides to put 50 signs across the front of a building, you could do.
You could. I don't know through the sign program process that we'd find that compatible, but you would be limited not by.
That's discretionary. I mean, they could. There's nothing that says they can't.
Correct.
Within that stated one-to-one area.
Within the area.
So part of the issue here that we had brought up when this was initiated was a landlord sometimes actually would prefer to not have to play politics with his or her tenants by saying, look, if you're on the first or second floor, you're eligible for that signage on the wall. Here, they get to play traffic cop between any of the tenants inside of the building. And so if that ground floor signage was taken by somebody on the 4th floor and a new tenant comes into that ground floor, they would either have to redo the entire sign program or go without in terms of wall signage. But the counterbalance that the council identified when you initiated this was to say, well, but it's still more meaningful to be able to have everybody in that building through their own private efforts by the landlord and his or her tenants be able to put together a sign program that works best for the building as a private concern.
But I'd like to see when this comes back, I'd like to see some examples, sketch it out, I guess, of what the maximum signage would allow, different examples, getting about number of tenants, that kind of thing. I'd like to know, would we be able to, would conceivably, and putting aside the idea that there's an internal review process because personnel changes, things can change. I'd like to see what would be the maximum signage that the ordinance would allow, assuming that your staff says okay to it. I'd like to know what that outer limit is.
We can sketch together a few examples, but
Because in other words, you have that one-to-one. Let's say you fill up everything up to that one-to-one limit. I'd like to know what that looks like.
You may have more signs, but you should have generally the same square footage of signage because you're dealing within that linear footage of the frontage.
Well, like you said, most of these buildings don't have that many tenants. So I'd like to know I'd like to know what to expect. So if we pass this and in 6 months the building owners decide to give as many tenants as they can those first floor signs, I'd like to know before people start complaining to us what that actually looks like on these buildings.
Yeah, and it's going to look different on every building depending on its
I understand.
architectural
That's why I'm saying
features.
show me the maximum of what would be allowable on the building, assuming that every tenant wants a sign on that particular space and the landlord wants to try to give them all a sign.
So what
would that then look
we'll
like?
do is give you a range similar to what we did last April, because as Phil points out, some building owners may not want to do it, and some may want everything. And
Well,
so,
that's why I'm saying, show
right.
me if they wanted
We'll show you a
everything.
range, right.
Well, I mean, I know if they don't want to do it, what it looks like. It looks like there's no signs or there's only a couple signs. I want to know what the most signage they could put on these buildings would be.
But we don't want to give the false impression that every building would look like
No,
this,
of course not. I understand that every building's not going to be
which is why we would provide that range for you.
Okay, I don't need to see a building without any signs. I think what we need to see is, I don't want to say worst case scenario because I don't want to imply that would necessarily even be bad. I'd like to know kind of the max out of what it would be. The same way if I asked you if we were looking at zoning and I said to you, what would be the apps, if we maxed out the site with the largest building that the zoning would allow, you wouldn't give me a range, you'd give me a shape of what that zoning would be. I'd like to know kind of what the signage would be if a building owner wanted to put much signage as they could on the building within the ordinance.
And just so we're clear, the calculation is 1 square foot for each 1 linear foot of frontage. Is that correct?
Correct.
So if you had 100-foot frontage, you'd be able to do
to divvy up the 100 square
a
feet.
10 by 10 sign or a 5 by 20 sign. So you should be able to just do some mock-ups for us and let us know what it is.
Before you leave, if I may, Mr.
Mr.
Mayor,
Garbett.
most of these buildings, they have a certain number of storefronts. Like they have a bank or 2-3 units that are on the ground floor, and their sign location is already marked on the building. Most of them already have a recessed area for their signs. and based on the frontage of that unit, they have a sign on top of their storefront. So the square footages, it will not change. The square footage of the sign that allowed will not change. And the number of signs will not change because most of these buildings, they don't have an area to put a 2x2 sign, and so you can add 20 more on the building. And these are institutional owners, and I don't think any of them are going to change their sign. They already have a sign program in place. The purpose of this ordinance was in the same location with the same size, if the first floor tenant does not want a sign, the owner will have a choice to give that sign space to a tenant that is renting 4 floors and they are from 4th floor up. And they can't have a sign, not on the top, not in the bottom. So that was the main concern. But my understanding is the size of the square footage will not change. It will be the same. And also the number of signs that you can put on the building, they are basically on top of, above every storefront, and they don't have more locations for them to just plant signs on all over the building. But they do the exercise, it's not a problem. I don't think anybody would want to have a tenant that is renting 4 or 3 floors of these large high-rises. They wouldn't want a 2x2 sign on that building that you can see it behind the street. So the only thing was that the owner has a choice to give one of his tenants a discretion or an opportunity to have a sign same size as the rest of the tenants on the first and second floor. That's all.
Can I ask a question? You mentioned second floor signs. So if you have a building kind of like the one that's on the screen now where you have, or forgetting that, let's say you have a building that's got storefronts on the first floor with signs above them and they don't have any storefronts on the second floor, it's typical office up above. Does that mean that now they could add signs all across the second floor as well?
The first and second floor are eligible as they are today for
right, but today,
signs.
Most of them don't. Unless they have a store there, they're not putting signs for tenants that are inside the building on the second floor.
Typically, we haven't seen that in the high-rises.
But under this ordinance, they could. So let's say they decided to, they could now add signs all along the second floor of a building that has no stores underneath it where that hasn't been before. So that's why I'd like to see taken to the extreme what this can look like, because that's a very different look in our downtown. Again, maybe not bad, but it's a very different look than what we have now. So I think that we should be mindful of that as well. And the other, somebody had brought this up in an email to me. Does that then encourage them to start wanting to cut street trees and to asking us to cut back street trees so that people can see those signs now from the street? Because would be a real concern for me. Do we typically allow people to do that, to cut street trees so that signage is visible?
To my knowledge, no.
We have trimmed the heck out of the Brand Boulevard trees and thinned them so the signs on the mid-Brand area are visible.
So if we start allowing signs now on the second floor, there's much more of a desire maybe to start topping trees off or cutting trees back.
That's a policy discussion that council should have.
I would tell you our current code, as it stands today, allows signage for a second floor tenant on the second floor. So that would not change. Now, you may have a lot of second floor tenants that don't want signage on the second floor, but now you've got somebody on the 5th floor that wants signage, and the owner could say, I'll put you on the second floor. So, yes, we could have more signs that way. And Mr. Garpetian, to your point, we're trying to figure a way to do this so that owners have some flexibility. Let's say today you have a ground floor tenant with 40 linear square feet of frontage. You could have a 40 square foot sign. If our minimum signs are 20 square feet, you could say in my sign program, I want that space to have 2 20-foot signs. So now you have more than just that one sign that was there before. Yeah, now, if you'd like us to change to limit it to only storefronts, areas where storefronts are, we could do that as well. But that starts to take away some of the flexibility we were trying to achieve.
Look, the only reason I brought this up was these are institutional owners. They spend over $100 million on these buildings. I don't think they're going to do anything to jeopardize their own properties by adding signs. We had an example from Koreatown or whatever at last presentation a few months ago, I don't think anybody wants to do that. If they wanted to do that, they would have done it on the second floor today. They could say, hey, you can have a sign and ask their tenants to put a sign up. So I think we need to extend the courtesy to them to decide. Basically, what this ordinance does, in a nutshell, is everything stays the same except the tenants, the name of the tenant on the sign. Basically, that's the way it is. Everything stays the same. Right now, they can have two signs, right? The tenant on the first floor can have two signs instead of one sign.
Well, they could have one sign. They're only allowed one sign. It could be 40 square feet.
Right, but the tenant on the second floor can have a sign on the first floor if they decide to have two signs.
They would have a sign on the second floor. Second floor tenant, under our current code,
Okay.
second floor tenant on the second
The
floor.
square footage, basically the square footage will stay the same. The number of signs may change. That's what
Correct.
we're hearing. Okay.
Correct. And I guess just to kind of close this out, we're using the sign program as a check and balance. We agree with you that most of those institutional tenants, they're not going to go hog wild and put all sorts of signs. But the sign program's in place to say, this is appropriate signage, now you go distribute it among your tenants how you'd like, which we think meets the spirit of intent of what the initiation
I think
was.
so.
When this comes back, I would like to know what our policy is about trimming those street trees based on tenants and buildings. I don't like the idea that someone will put a sign up wherever they want it and then expect us to cut a public tree back, which is there to give shade to people walking by.
I'll second that.
Blocking their
Yeah,
sign.
I'll second that.
And I think we should review that policy, especially if we're going to be making these changes.
Yeah, I will double check with Public Works. I believe we've worked with tenants on a case-by-case basis, but generally speaking, those street trees are there, and we know they're there, and we have designed them so that you can't see signage. But we'll check in Public Works.
We'll have Public Works come here so
We
that
will.
there aren't questions that you
Yeah.
can't answer. I think we need to set some policy about that.
Very well.
I think if we are really concerned about the trees, we need to pay a little bit more attention to the Green Street program that we are having, and you have to remove 17 or 20 trees in order to do the Green Street program. But I second that as well. Let's bring the tree trimming issue as well.
Okay, so this is just for introduction today, but I have one more question. The only difficulty that I foresee is confusion and gamesmanship by the fifth floor CPA who wants his sign to be on the ground floor above, H&R Block. So can there be some language that the signage shall not cause undue confusion to the public? I mean, do you see how that could? You see what I'm saying?
We do, and I think that's
That's just not
partially.
fair.
I
I'm
think
all for fairness.
That's partially a reflection of the way this is implemented today, right? I mean, so we keep it. It's the first two floors. Period. End of story. If we're going to open up the door to allow this flexibility, with that flexibility comes opportunities for other interpretations, and so it's kind of in for a penny, in for a pound. That and restraint of trade issues, I don't know how we would get around
just
that.
enforceability issues, I think would be difficult. That's why the decision is sort of up to the landlord initially to come suggest the program and bring it to the city for
I
approval.
mean, what if there's an urgent care on the fourth floor and the urgent care sign is directly over a eye clinic? And would that not be harmful to the public? Someone coming in with an urgent medical problem walks into the optometrist and says, I'm just saying, okay, I'm just saying. But this is for introduction, and I'm not sure if I'm going to carry this line of thought much further, but I just wanted to throw that out there. Any other comments on this? This will be coming back next week, correct?
I believe so.
Yes.
Next.
Should be available.
So there's no other questions.
Close the hearing if you hadn't.
I didn't open the hearing, so let me open the hearing. Are there any cards from the public, by the way?
No.
I'll close the hearing, and would someone like to introduce it?
I'll introduce it.
Seconded.
Okay, thank you. And that concludes the business on the special meeting agenda. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second by Mr. Carpetja.
Second.
We are adjourned.